the anatomy of Jesus. Picked up a handout this morning. You might notice those first two questions. The question, what does this mean? What do we mean by this title, by this phrase, Jesus' anatomy? If you take a look at various sermons that are out there and lessons in books, online, you can do a Google search. Every sermon, at least, and lesson that I could find that included something like anatomy of Jesus, they're focused on the physiological experience of Jesus during his arrest, trial, the scourging especially, and then crucifixion. Looking at maybe from a very medical standpoint, and even medical professionals have written documents describing all that happened to Jesus, all that happens to a person, specifically Jesus in mind, during that kind of death, that kind of execution. Well, that is not our focus this morning. Not that that's not a good thing to look at and think about and might be appropriate for another time. But this morning, I'd like us to look at something else about Jesus, his physical characteristics. What does the Bible tell us? What do the Scriptures tell us about what Jesus was like? Was he tall? Short? I mean, he was probably pretty short, but the Bible doesn't say. Was he thin? Was he muscular? He was a carpenter. He might have had some muscles about him. What was he like? We do not know. It's interesting that the gospel accounts never give us the common characteristics of one that you would write about. If you read a novel or you read a biography, you expect, at least somewhere in the story, someone to describe the main character. Usually other characters are described. And you get their hair color, you get their physique, you get other parts of their physiological makeup. But in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or even in the letters, you get none of that. But what do we see? And this morning, we see his eyes. His eyes. And this one may sound strange, but hopefully it will sound less strange in a few minutes. We see his stomach or his chest. And then we see his hands. Then we see his feet. 4 aspects of the anatomy of Jesus for your consideration this morning. Let's look at those in that order then. First, his eyes. Let's turn over to John chapter 1, verse 18, as we think about his eyes. It's been said that the eyes have it. The eyes are the window to the soul. I wonder what it would have been like to peer into the eyes of Jesus. I wonder what color his eyes were. Were they dark brown? That might make sense, given his ethnicity, but who knows? Maybe they were blue. I don't know. But it's something to think about. The Bible does tell us he wasn't necessarily handsome or had an appearance that we would enjoy from that more physical standpoint. Isaiah 53, 1 through 3. Let's read together from John chapter 1, verse 18. John 1, 18. This is at the end of John's prologue as he has described how the Word that was in the beginning, the Word that was God, became flesh. So he says this in John 1:18, no one has ever seen God. And then this is something that Jews had known for centuries. About the closest thing was Moses back in Exodus 34, when he requests, I want to see your face. And there it is, you can't see my face and live, but then God, in some physical appearance, passes by Moses. And Moses, it is said, was able to see God's back, whatever that even meant, for sure, we don't know. No one can see God's face and live. So John says no one's ever seen God. But, he says, the only God, who is at the Father's side, He has made Him known. For those who lived during Jesus' earthly life, they were able to actually see, in a way, we could say, they looked into the very face of God. And when you and I read the gospel accounts, and we read about Jesus, we are beholding God in human flesh. So when He looks, we see His eyes. Eyes that were at times filled with tears as He weeps over Lazarus in John 11. We get the shortest verse in English. Jesus wept. As He weeps over Jerusalem, people that would not repent regardless of what he had done and what He said. And so He's acquainted with grief, Isaiah seems. And then take a look at this one. The mixed emotions of His eyes. We're in John chapter 1. Now let's go to Mark's gospel account. Mark chapter 3. This is when Jesus is going to battle with some of the religious leaders over the Sabbath. They had turned the Sabbath laws into a weapon. They didn't care about God or about God's law. It was about how they could use the Sabbath and the traditions they had tacked onto it to control people. And so Jesus in Mark 3 verse 5 says that He looked around at them with anger. Would that be something you would list? Would that be expected when you talk about the eyes of Jesus? That if Jesus is looking, that you see eyes of anger? And I know you've seen that probably in somebody else's face in your life. You have some idea this morning of what kind of look this was. And so here His eyes have this anger penetrates as He looks around at them. But then the verse also says He looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. And He heals the man with the withered hand. Because their position came down to, you can't even help someone. And all Jesus does is breathe a word, which, by the way, had in no way broke the Sabbath, not even their traditions, really. But it's about Jesus versus them. And their hearts, because of that, are so hard, they're unwilling for a man to get his life back. And so when you look at the eyes of Jesus, one of the things you see this morning is how hypocrisy, pride, the hardness of our human heart, how that angers Him, and how it also grieves Him. Do you think maybe Mark is saying that Jesus looks, and it's an angry look, but His eyes are also beginning to fill with tears? His eyes, the very face of God, with some mixed emotion. His eyes. Now, this is about the best I can do. And so when you think about Jesus' eyes this morning, you might think about some sunglasses as at least a memory attachment point for this morning. Let's think now about His, stomach or His chest. Let's turn together to Luke chapter 4. I almost said Matthew 4 because both of those are the same account. They're both about Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. Luke chapter 4, 1 through 4. Luke says this, "And Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. The grammatical indication is that Jesus is tempted throughout this period of 40 days. And he ate nothing, he goes on to say, during those days. We usually wrap it up by saying Jesus fasted for 40 days. What did that feel like? That's why I put down the phrase that his stomach was pained, or burned rather, with hunger. Pained is the next line. Have you ever been really hungry? Some of us, we miss a meal or two, and it's like the whole world is falling apart, right? And we're not just hungry, what are we? We're hangry, yes, somebody had it. But what would that be like to go 40 days with nothing? And so Satan says when he ended, he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone, to become bread." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone." Jesus' stomach burned with hunger as he's tested, as he's tempted by Satan. And so, no surprise, this morning, you might think of a loaf of bread as somewhat of a memory tool this morning. His stomach, because of us, he came into this world, and because of us to be our Savior, his stomach burned hunger. Then we turn in Luke to Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7, verses 11 and following, Jesus comes up on a funeral procession. He is greeted in a way by a widow with her only son. She's lost her husband. Now she's lost her only son, perhaps her only child. And Jesus interrupts the funeral procession as they carry the young man out. And in this area, there are today still graveyards that you can see nearby. And as they carry him, likely on a wicker basket large enough to carry a man, to a briar, Jesus responds. Look at verse 13. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion. He had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. The word that we translate compassion, it means a sympathy, a feeling that is so overwhelming and so strong that it's like it comes from your stomach, that it turns your stomach. You feel it in your chest. You feel it in your abdomen. You might even get sick because of the pain. And you may have been there where some emotional pain is so great that you get physically sick. That's the word here. It is the strongest word in the Greek language for compassion. And it isn't just used here, it is used over and over throughout the gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of them use this multiple times to describe what Jesus feels here when he sees a grieving widow. His stomach then is pained with compassion. That's who Jesus is. He is touched by my grief, my trouble, my sorrow. And it hurts him. That's his stomach or his chest. But now, thirdly, we turn to consider his hands. Hands can tell you quite a lot about a person. You might notice something about their occupation by looking at their hands. You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to notice some things like that. A person has very callous, stiff hands. You get some idea. You may even shake their hand and you notice that it's kind of on the soft side, and you might get an idea of what their life has been like. You might see scars. I wonder what Jesus' hands looked like. He spent quite a number of years working in physical labor before he began his teaching ministry. I don't think we would be off this morning to think that his hands had calluses and scars, imperfections from work, a worker's hands. But let's stay in Luke chapter 7 and notice, or actually let's go back to Mark. We're going to come back to Luke chapter 7. Let's look at Mark chapter 1 first. We were in Mark 3 earlier, so now we go back to Mark. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus touches the untouchable. Can you imagine that one? To go weeks, months, even years without human touch? Or maybe the touch of other lepers? Probably not even that. And in Mark chapter 1, in verse 40, a leper came to him, imploring him. And so moved with pity, moved with compassion, he stretched out his hand and touched him. It's like Jesus is always doing the unthinkable. Everybody knew you don't touch, you don't even get close to a leper. But he does. And it's been said, so I'll say it again, that Jesus didn't really touch a leper and become unclean himself, because when Jesus touches the leper, he's a leper no more. It says he touched him and said to him, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Jesus is willing to reach out and touch the untouchable. Now we go back to Luke chapter 7 and look at what happens after his stomach is pained with compassion in Luke 7:14 and 15. After he says to the widow, do not weep, then he came up, verse 14 of Luke 7 says, and touched the bier. This is along the same lines. You touch a corpse, you touch what the corpse is being carried on, and you're now ceremonially unclean. Is Jesus unclean? Either way, he's not concerned about that. Jesus touches the bier, and it's almost, you could see it as if he's taking over. What death has claimed, what Satan has said, mine, Jesus steps up and touches the bier as if to say, I'm taking ownership of this situation, this grief, this death. He touches. And then it says the bearer stood still. Wonder what they were thinking. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up. What a phrase. The dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. He presented him back to his mother. And I included that because I'd like to think that may have included some touch. It's like he stops the procession with a touch, and then he presents them. I can see Jesus taking the young man by the hand and taking his mother and in a way joining them together again as he hands her son back to her. He touches the heart. The next chapter, Luke chapter 8, the very end of that chapter, verse 54, is when Jesus does something very similar. He's been called to the house of a 12-year-old girl, the only daughter of her parents. And he's delayed by his compassion. And when he gets there, it's too late. It's over. But he goes in. And he takes, in verse 54, he takes the little girl by the hand. He tells her to get up. When we see Jesus' hands, they're busy touching the untouchable, touching our hearts. There's a lot we can learn about Jesus' hands. I think this morning about the song, Daddy's Hands. They were kind and gentle when I was crying, hard as steel when I'd done wrong. Daddy's hands weren't always gentle, the song says, but I've learned to understand that there was always love in Daddy's hands. So this morning, you might think, and the adult gloves I had were all kind of filthy, and so this was the best option I had. But you might think about gloves this morning when you think about Jesus' hands. Now we got one more, and that's Jesus' feet. I don't even own a pair of sandals. I'm not a sandals guy, and so this was what I came up with this morning. I don't think Jesus ever wore shoes like this, but you can think of shoes when you think of his feet. Feet of Jesus. Feet is a part of our anatomy that some people find inherently gross. They don't like to see pictures even of people's feet, regardless of how nice or not those feet may be. I've always found it fascinating how we've created different subsets of modeling in our world. You've got hand models, back to hands. You've got feet models. What's that like, to be a feet model? So what were his feet like? I don't mean this to be trivial or trite. You could say that Jesus would be a candidate for a foot model. Because Isaiah 52, 7 and 8 describes those who bring glad tidings, who bring the gospel of peace. It's the first time the Bible ever uses the word for gospel as having beautiful feet as they come on the mountains. Now that passage, that specific statement is never directly applied to Jesus, although some of the context is. Paul picks up this statement later in Romans chapter 10 and applies it to preachers being sent with the gospel. We know, though, that Jesus preached the gospel. And so you could say that Jesus' feet, because as he walked across Galilee, as he traveled teaching and preaching the gospel, bringing the good news of a king, of a kingdom that he would say is at hand, that Jesus' feet, yes, were beautiful. And as we take the gospel, if we're willing to, and we are in that same path with Jesus. But his feet, from a more physical standpoint, were dirty. What do we read in John chapter 13? I'll get there eventually. The first 6 verses. The scene where Jesus meets with his disciples in the upper room to observe the Passover. Normally, the host would have some servants non-Jewish servants were preferred because this task of washing dirty feet is a very low thing. So at the beginning, when you got there, the host would have a servant wash the feet of those gathered to eat. Keep in mind that in this time, they did not sit around a table with their feet tucked under. They reclined around a low table. So think about that. How would you like to eat a meal when someone else's dirty, stinky feet are at your head? Think about it. It's not fun. And so Jesus gets up. It's about, they're about to have the meal. It's not the beginning. But he waits until dinner, and then Jesus gets up and washes the disciples' feet. You could say that Jesus had dirty feet, walking around dusty roads and streets of Jerusalem and beyond. Or you could say that Jesus, the master of heaven and earth, showed us what humility and true greatness is like when he stoops, if you will, to wash dirty feet. The anatomy of Jesus. We've seen this morning his eyes to peer into the very face of the Son of God. We've seen this morning his stomach that burned with hunger, that was pained with compassion. We've seen his hands touching the untouchable, reaching hearts. And we've seen his feet as they brought the gospel of peace and salvation that might have been a little dirty too. But we could also think this morning of blood, not just tears, in his eyes. But according to passages like Revelation 1:13, and you've got some verses there that you can look at on your own, his eyes now burn like a flame. We think about his stomach, his chest. We could also think of the scourging that rips someone apart, or the spear piercing his side, that same area. But then in Revelation 1, we read that he now wears a golden sash around his chest as royal king Jesus. Of course, we think about his hands, more so his wrists, but you get the idea. Nailed to a wooden cross. Or now he holds a rod of iron, Revelation 19:15, to rule the nations. A scepter of righteousness, Hebrews 1:8. What his feet? Just like his hands, likely around his ankles, pinned to the bottom of that piece of wood. But now, John says, when he looked in Revelation 1, his feet it looked like they were made of furnished brass. Strength and power and brightness and glory. And Paul says that he sits on a throne, the throne, waiting until he props up his feet on all his enemies. Until every enemy, including death itself, is fully under his feet like a footstool. The anatomy of Jesus. The song that we sing is a call from Him to our hearts to come to Him, to come and take His hand, to die with Him, to be raised with Him, to one day see His face, as we sing in another song, face to face, when I see Jesus. Let's sing together.